legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Marco Vigato, who joins us to discuss his book, The Empires of Atlantis, The Origins of Ancient Civilizations and Mystery Traditions Throughout the Ages. Exploring more than 100,000 years of Earth's history, Vigato combines recent discoveries in the fields of archaeology, geology, anthropology and genetics with the mystery teachings of antiquity to investigate the true origins of civilization. Establishing the historical and geological reality of Atlantis stretching back to 432,000 BC, he traces the course of Atlantean civilization through its three empires, revealing how civilization rose and fell several times over this lengthy span of time. The author shows that Atlantis did not vanish in one terrible day and night, but survived in a variety of different forms well into the historical era. He examines the role of survivors in restarting civilization in different parts of the world, from Gobekli Tepe and Egypt to India, Mesopotamia and the Americas. He documents their colonies and outposts around the globe, offering unique views of the colossal network of pyramids, earthen mounds and other megalithic monuments they left behind. Drawing on more than 500 ancient and modern sources and sharing never-before-seen photographs from his own personal exploration of hundreds of archaeological sites around the world, Vegato shows not only that Atlantis was real, but that the whole world is now being called to become a new Atlantis and awaken into a new golden age. Hello and welcome, Marco, and thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be on the show with you.
Marco, today we're going to be discussing your new book. It's entitled The Empires of Atlantis, The Origins of Ancient Civilizations and Mystery Traditions Throughout the Ages. Before we dive into that, just give listeners a bit of information about your background and work in general.
Yeah, for sure. I'm originally from Italy, but I've been living and working in Mexico for the past 7 years now. I've been interested in the question of the origins of civilization since as early as I can remember. And for the past 15 years, I've been researching the idea of a lost civilization of the last ice age, maybe identified with Plato's Atlantis. And I've spent many years traveling around the world on virtually every continent, trying to document the evidence, both the monumental evidence, the cultural evidence of that lost civilization. A result of that is my latest book, The Empires of Atlantis, that you just described.
Okay, we're kind of going to do this in two halves. In the first section, we'll look at some of the archaeological evidence and archaeological dimensions of this. And then after that, we'll look a little bit more at the occult and esoteric dimensions, because there's some very interesting information there as well. I suppose the bottom line here is that it's contained in myths from all around the world. Myths, legends, spiritual traditions. There's this idea of a long lost golden age is just a global phenomenon. And the idea that there was an advanced civilization, we can see there were advanced civilizations in the past. We look at, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, some of the civilizations in the Middle East prior to that. So that's accepted. But the idea of anything beyond that seems to be plunges into controversy, and people find it very difficult to accept, particularly anything going back, beyond the last ice age, essentially. But this is an idea that just won't go away. And of course, there's been many crackpot theories, and with no evidence whatsoever put forward, which haven't really helped the case for Atlantis, or whatever name you want to give it. But the evidence continues to accumulate that basically the story of human civilization, of advanced or relatively advanced, it continues to push back the dates further and further into history. As Graham Hancock likes to say, stuff just keeps getting older.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a very valid point, and I believe they were still very much influenced by a view of linear time, which is, of course, inspired much of modern day evolutionary theory. It's this idea that civilization is on a constant path towards progress and evolution, and that this has been pretty generally true, I would say, for the past 1,000 years or so, at least if you look at the West. However, this has not always been the case in previous times. We find throughout the world many examples of very powerful, successful civilizations that went into decline and even disappeared or became extinct, even without going as far as the last ice age. If you look at the consequences of the fall of Rome in Western Europe, the Dark Ages that followed, there are plenty of examples of great and powerful empires that collapsed, giving way and opening up the way to ages of chaos and turmoil. So that's something very common. It's almost a pattern, I would say, in human history, which we are in a way ignoring at our own peril. Now, this view, this sort of a false sense of a linear progression, linear evolution of civilization, however, is very different from the worldview of many traditional societies and many ancient civilizations and cultures that instead embraced a view of time and history as essentially cyclical. So they believed in the existence of multiple cycles of civilization, hence this idea of a golden age, and the fact that the golden age was going to give way to a silver age, bronze age, iron age, and cyclical repetitions. It's this idea that there have been prior cycles of creation, prior cycles of civilization, some of which may well stretch back thousands, if not tens of thousands of years.
Yeah, the concept of linear time dominates all our thinking really about reality, doesn't it, and history and the future. And of course, it appears to make so much sense because our own lives, relatively short, appear to move from A to B, and that's one event follows another. And we look back in history and we see evidence for previous civilizations, and we plan and plot for the future of our own civilization. Mm-hmm. So the idea of cyclical events may not be so difficult for people to accept, at least in theory, that things do rise and fall. We see evidence for that in terms of civilization. But the idea of cyclical time for many people is so counterintuitive, that there only is a past which leads into now and then off into the future. How could cyclical time possibly be a thing?
Yeah, and I think we're surrounded by many examples of cyclical time. I think, of course, of the cycle of the seasons, which maybe have been the most obvious inspiration for these ancient worldviews of cyclical time. But there may be as well some even broader cosmic cycles. So this idea of recurring cataclysms, particularly, which was, by the way, also an idea expressed by Plato in his Atlantis story, when he talks about multiple destructions, multiple cataclysms of fire and water. And there is almost the idea underlying this concept of cyclical time, of recurring cataclysms as well, that at very large intervals of time would cause the downfall of civilization or the collapse of civilization, thus forcing humanity to start over again, as Plato also said, to start over again like children after the great destruction. Now, if we investigate, if we look into the causes of some of these cycles, we realize that even at the cosmological scale, there are, in fact, cycles that may have an influence over the course of life and civilization on Earth. One of those is what is known as the precession of the equinoxes, that had a key importance for many ancient cultures. So this idea that over a very long period of time, over 25,000 years, the sun completes a revolution of the zodiac. So from the point of view of an observer on Earth, the sun will be seen rising in a different constellation with about 25,000 years to the full cycle of the 12 constellations that make up the zodiac. But there may be even longer cycles. We're talking about galactic cycles as well. And I think the effects of all these different cycles on life on Earth and on the course of civilization, they're very poorly understood because nobody has lived through one entire cycle. Our modern science is at best 500 years old. So it's very difficult to get a grasp of these very long cycles. And this is where I think we can learn much from the experience of ancient civilization, that even if we go back to the first historical civilizations of Egypt, of Sumer, they preserved records and traditions of earlier cycles, covering thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. So I think there is value in that legacy, in that knowledge that has been transmitted to us from ancient civilization. And what that legacy refers to and talks about is this idea that there are cycles, there are cosmic cycles, first of all, that influence the course of life and civilization on Earth over very long periods of time.
Well, the earliest sort of astronomers that we're aware of in human civilization, obviously we don't really know how far back human civilization as we recognize it goes, but from what we do understand, they obviously had incredible patience. Without the technology we have, mainly, modern astronomy benefited from computing technology, the ability to crunch numbers, which was all done, with like ink and parchment, or however it was done, clay tablets in millennia gone by. But the observations to begin to, that charted the movements in the heavens, what was also part of astrology. I mean, it took immense amounts of time in terms of human lifespans, so just the patience and the vision to sort of carry on, lifetime after lifetime, century in, century out, to map the movements to eventually begin to say something about, of the planetary bodies and what cycles they moved in. So, and it contrasts quite starkly with, yes, we do have a lot of this technological capability, but about how quick we are to make pronouncements about history in the modern era. We just say, this is how it is. We've done the work. And, you can't imagine our current civilization embarking on, never mind, astronomical project, but any sort of project really that would take lifetimes. We just don't seem to have that in us anymore.
Right. Right. No, and I think at the end of the day, this idea of constant progress of linear time, I think what that amounts to is a wonderful myth at the end of the day, which is and it has been repeatedly contradicted by the evidence. So one excellent case in point has been just in recent decades, Gobekli Tepe, and the way the discovery of these extremely important archaeological site in southeastern Turkey has really upended our view of history. We used to think of civilization as essentially something that started in Egypt and Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago, and now we find evidence. And by the way, it's not only Gobekli Tepe, but it's a number of sites now. It's over a dozen sites in southeastern Turkey and then throughout the Levant that show that sophisticated human societies already existed as early as the end of the last ice age. We're talking about the time period over 10,000 years ago. And what is extraordinary about a site like Gobekli Tepe is, first of all, its sophistication. We're talking about a site that is at least 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, so that in fact the builders of Stonehenge would be closer to us in time than the builders of Gobekli Tepe were to them. And what you find at a place like Gobekli Tepe is incredible monumental architecture employing huge blocks of stone, these T-shaped pillars, some of which weighed in excess of 50 tons. So it's exceptional sophistication. You also find clearly an attention to the sky, to the stars, hinted by the fact that many of these structures are also very carefully astronomically oriented. And these are at a time when scientists and archaeologists just no more than 10 or 15 years ago, perhaps, believed that the whole of the human population at the time was still in a very primitive hunter-gathering stage. And now we have evidence that, at least in parts of the world, that was not the case. There were already sophisticated people around that were capable of conducting astronomical observation, that possessed advanced mathematical and architectural knowledge, and then all of this vanished. If we are to believe again the findings from the latest excavations at Gobekli Tepe, it looks like by 7,500 BC the site was completely abandoned. It was actually deliberately buried, and so we have to ask ourselves how many more sites like Gobekli Tepe exist around the world. I think we have just barely scratched the surface of how many more lost civilizations may exist or may have existed in the past, have gone completely undetected.
Yes, well, the idea or the fact that Gobekli Tepe was abandoned and then deliberately covered over, some have suggested this was to protect and preserve the site for the future. But the question is, well, why do this? You know, what was coming? What was the perceived threat? What was the reason to walk away from the site and basically mothball it? And this plays into the whole idea of recurring cataclysms, because some people have speculated that there was some kind of sense or understanding that some event was coming, some kind of very large scale event that would threaten the population, would threaten the site, and so they basically, walked away from it after protecting it.
Yeah, and I think Gobekli Tepe is a very interesting site for a number of reasons, but one of those is this idea, again, of recurring cataclysm. Gobekli Tepe was built at the end or immediately after the end of the Younger Dryas, which was a time of cataclysms. Now, there is a very strong evidence that a massive cometary impact, or maybe even a couple of impacts, occurred both at the beginning and at the end of the Younger Dryas. So these people would have looked at the sky with significant concern about the possibility that these like very dramatic events of the end of the last ice age could again happen and could again like repeat themselves. So in a way, they would have been looking at the sky, trying to find the signs of the next cataclysm, of the next destruction. And there are many. There is actually the suggestion that many of the representations that we find on the pillars of Gobekli Tepe actually hint at this idea of cosmic catastrophes or recurring cataclysm. Many of these animal symbols, like the scorpion, for instance, various figures of birds that we find on the pillars, may actually be read astronomically as some of the earliest representations of constellations. So that what we have there may actually be a sort of star chart or a representation of celestial events that occurred in the very remote past at the end of the last ice age. Now, something also very interesting that I wanted to stress about the Gobekli Tepe is the fact that also from the point of view of cultural evolution, Gobekli Tepe literally upends that paradigm, because the most sophisticated stages and layers of construction at Gobekli Tepe are also the earliest. It's as if the builders of Gobekli Tepe got then steadily worse at the art of temple building. That civilization appeared almost all of a sudden, as if out of nowhere, with already a very perfected knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, monumental architecture, and then over the following millennia, that knowledge slowly decayed and disappeared to the point that by the time of the site's abandonment, around 7,500 BC, these people seemed unable to erect the same type of monuments. The style and the technique of construction becomes much more simple, much more primitive, with the use of smaller stone. The alignments are not as accurate. So you have to wonder, where did that knowledge come from? If that knowledge appeared as if out of nowhere, already fully formed, fully perfected, we're talking about time over 10,000 years ago, where did that knowledge come from? So there is almost a suggestion that the builders of Gobekli Tepe may have come from somewhere else, bringing with them a more advanced culture and civilization, which they try to transplant in that specific region of southeastern Turkey. But their efforts were clearly not successful if the site was then abandoned, and for the following 5,000 years, nothing of that scaling complexity would again be built, probably nowhere else or anywhere else in the world.
Just to rewind very slightly, you mentioned the Younger Dryas boundary event. Just in case listeners don't know and they want to look it up, that's Dryas is spelled Dryas, and that's the Younger Dryas boundary event. And that was something that was basically contested for a long time. People skeptical about the idea or the ideas contained in that. But of course, things have moved on a great deal since then. In terms of potentially foreseeing or being concerned about some kind of cataclysmic event coming down the line, there's also this profusion of underground constructions,
right,
some of which are so big as to be called cities. You know, the thousands of people would be able to live underground. Some of them are over multiple stories, as it were. You know, they go down multiple levels. You know, and it's incredible work in itself. And now human beings are not naturally evolved to live underground. It's not something that living in caves is one thing, but actually living beneath the earth is something that most of us find very unappealing. You know, we want to be out in the light and the fresh air. So these constructions themselves are fascinating part of this overall picture. Is like, you know, what was it that caused these? And these too can be found all over the world.
Right. So on the one hand, as you say, there is we found throughout the world many examples of these underground cities. I think you're specifically referring to those that are found in Turkey, and there are many examples. There in Kuyu is one of the largest ones that goes down over 20 levels below ground. There is controversy as to the age of many of these underground cities, with certain researchers claiming that the earliest, the lowest level may even date back to the end of the last ice age. But certainly these were used multiple times throughout history. Think of the idea, and we're probably lucky enough to live at a time in history when our planet has not been hit by any major cataclysms, but there is evidence from times past of a number of truly catastrophic, cataclysmic events in the past of our planet. So it makes sense for people that lived through these cataclysms to create shelters or places of refuge, where they could take shelter if another cataclysm of that kind would again take place and before our planet. There are also many very interesting traditions around the world of how humanity survived through many similar cataclysms. Of course, most of us will be familiar with the biblical story of Noah and the ark that talks about this great deluge and how Noah and his family managed to survive on this giant boat together with herds of animals and seeds. But we also find very similar myths throughout the world. One of the most fascinating ones, at least to me, is the Persian myth. It's the Persian equivalent of the flood story that describes how the Persian flood hero called Yima or Yamshed actually built a subterranean city. It goes as far as providing the specifications of how this subterranean city was built, with all its different levels, of what it contained in terms of people, in terms of the population of it, how many different species of animals and plants and seeds were stored in these underground city. And it suggests that people were somehow able to survive or withstand these devastating cataclysm by taking shelter underground for a very long period of time, until conditions on the surface allow them once again to re-emerge and restart civilization. What is particularly interesting about many of these accounts is that they suggest also a level of technology, a level of sophistication very far in advance of what we will be inclined to believe existed at that time. We're talking about the time over 10,000 years ago. Even the biblical description of Noah's Ark would actually refer to some immense ship, probably one of the largest ships ever built, truly comparable in size to a modern aircraft carrier almost. So clearly something far beyond the capabilities of primitive and sophisticated people. And also, if you look at many of these descriptions of these round cities, as in the Persian myth, assuming that these were real places, this would suggest a level of sophistication, of technological advancement, very far beyond certainly what we consider was available at the time, and possibly even beyond our present level of technological development. There are hints in the Persian myth even to the use of artificial illumination, artificial light inside this underground city, and the description of the specification, how they would have allowed crops to grow underground, which are all feats of science and engineering that have been only recently rediscovered, if at all.
Yes, well, you mentioned that the deluge myths, the deluge stories, are being global, not just a biblical tale. And prior to that, Well, basically, the idea of a global flood, and again, this ties in with the Younger Dryas, with the end of the Ice Age and a sudden, again, possibly because of something coming from off beyond the Earth and impacting the Earth, the sudden melting of ice sheets and sudden rise in sea level. And there's a lot of evidence for this, and this is said to be where these global deluge myths could come from. Now, the point of this being, in questioning what civilization might have been like prior to that, people are talking about what evidence do we have, what's in the archaeological record. What all we have are stories, myths, which a lot of people take to inherently mean something that's invented, but that's not really what the meaning of the word myth is as such. So it's entirely imaginable, conceivable how evidence for advanced civilization prior to a global deluge could be almost completely lost.
Right.
Just absolutely swept away. And not only then, there was all the decay that would happen in the meantime. I can't remember which book I was reading, but it was talking about future archaeologists looking back on our time,
yes,
maybe after some other sort of cataclysmic event or some huge earth changes that had wiped out our civilization, more or less. And the question was, where are all the Coke bottles? So the idea was being this was one of the most common things at one time produced by humanity, was that classic Coca-Cola bottle, that shape, which is still the most satisfying thing to drink Coke out of. In this book, the author pointed out almost all of those classic Coke bottles that have ever been produced are completely gone. And that if that's meant to be, if you're thinking you're going to be digging up billions of Coke bottles as evidence for our civilization, well, almost all of them are already gone. So no doubt there could be evidence depending on the nature of any future cataclysm. But of course, a global flood, you imagine something, I know it's a really cheesy, corny film and it's not actually very good, but, Kevin Costner in Waterworld, you see, if you had that level of flooding, on the earth for sustained for a long period of time, who knows what could be lost? That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com